Hello and welcome to the final part on my ItPsv90. In this video I will do the painting and weathering. I start the painting process by spraying a layer of primer over the entire model. Like all my recent builds, I will use Mr. Hobby Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black thinned with Mr. Colour Leveling Thinner. The primer goes down very well, it only needs a couple of layers and leaves a very smooth surface. I find that the Mr. Colour primer paint is very thick and usually requires a lot of thinner. I use about 2 parts thinner to 1 part primer, so 1 bottle of paint will definitely last you quite a while. Now I start painting the Splinter Camouflage pattern. The first colour I use is a medium green colour made from XF67 NATO green and XF71 copper green. This is sprayed over the entire model. I wanted to add post shading to the camouflage, and because I will have to mask each layer, I decided that each layer will need to be post shaded separately. The colour I used for this is XF1 Black and XF10 Flat Brown. This is sprayed in a very thin layer around all the details. Because I want the spray pattern to be more controlled and focused, I use my 0.2mm airbrush. After this I add some variation to the base colour and try to blend in the post shading. This is done by spraying on a lighter layer of the base green colour. I just use the same paints, but more of the XF71 cockpit green. This is again done with a 0.2mm airbrush. I only spray a very small amount of paint when doing this, and keep the airbrush close to the model to keep the lines small. For all of this airbrushing I use 20 psi. After the first colour is complete, I start adding masking tape to create the Splinter Camouflage pattern. The last time I had to do any sort of masking was for the digital camouflage for my ZSL92. At that time I used pre-cut masks, but this time I just used a standard masking tape cut into the shape that I wanted. This process was harder than I expected because of the uneven surface of the tank. You have to take a lot of care to make sure that the tape completely covers the surface and doesn't have any raised parts or the paint will get inside. The next camouflage colour that I paint is the dark grey. For this I used XF1 Black and XF69 NATO Black. As there had been a couple of days between me adding the masks and spraying this layer, I had to go over them and make sure that none of the masks had started to peel off. Because of the very dark colour, I skipped the post shading and went straight to highlights. To make this colour I used XF69 NATO Black mixed with a little XF2 white. I then added more masking tape like before. Initially I did try to follow the scheme from the instructions, but in the end I found that in some places it didn't seem to make sense, so I just went with what I thought looked good. For the final camouflage colour, I just used XF67 NATO Green. This was painted over all of the remaining areas. I also painted the wheels this colour. I repeated the same process as the first layer, so I added post shading with XF1 Black and XF10 Flat Brown around all the details. This paint mixture was also used over the tracks. Next I added the mottled lighter colour using NATO Green and Cockpit Green. Finally the painting is completed and I can start removing the masking tape. There was a lot to remove, so it really took a long time, but it's pretty satisfying to finally remove it. Luckily, this time it seems like the paint hasn't bled under the masking tape. This is the end result of the painting and masking. I think the camouflage looks good, it's pretty much what I wanted. If I were going to do it again, I would try to make the shapes a little bit smaller, but it really is hard to mask such an uneven surface. Also, I'm not entirely sure what happened with the black colour. Somehow it became more white after removing the tape, but with the weathering later, this shouldn't matter too much. The edges of where the masking tape has been is slightly raised, so I used some very fine sandpaper to smoothen them and make it less noticeable. I sprayed a couple of layers of Vallejo gloss varnish to seal in the paint and to prepare for the decals. Whenever I use Vallejo varnishes, I thin them with regular tap water. For the decals, I start by adding a small amount of Mr. Mark Setter in the area that I will put the decal. This helps to prepare the surface and improve decal adhesion. The decal is then moved into position, and once in place I use a cotton bud to gently press against it to push out any air underneath. This is quite important, as without it you will risk air getting trapped underneath, which will cause the clear parts of the decal to look silver. After leaving the decal in place for a couple of minutes, until all of the liquid on the decal has dried, I use a brush to apply a layer of microsol. This will cause the decal to wrinkle. Eventually it will spread back out and will stick to the surface better. If the surface is uneven, it will help to follow the surface. Takom decals are usually very thick, so it requires several layers of microsol. I usually keep adding it until it starts to wrinkle a little. I leave the decals for a day so that they are completely dry, then I spray over a layer of gloss varnish so that it matches the glossiness of the surface underneath. The next stage is to add some highlights to small details such as bolts. For this I use Vallejo acrylics to create a lighter shade of the base colour. This is repeated for each of the camouflage colours. I then applied a layer of Vallejo silk varnish over the entire model. Next I used the oil dot technique to add colour variation to the model. To do this I first wetted the area with odourless thinner, then I applied small dots of oil paints. The colours I chose are lighter and darker shades of the base colour, and also some grey, blue and yellow. I focus on one small area at a time because I find that if you leave the paint on for too long, the dots of paint will be hard to remove. This is also why I added odourless thinner at the beginning, so that the paint won't start drying as soon as I put it on. After the paints are dotted on, I use a flat brush and move it in an up and down motion to blend the dots of paint and create streaks. I try to blend the streaks a lot to keep the effect subtle. Later I can re-add some colours if I think the effect should be stronger. On the flat surfaces I use the same colours, but instead of dotting the paint on, I make random shapes and then dab the brush on to blend the paint. This effect helps to make the paint look old, faded and dirty, whilst also adding more variation to the camouflage colours. After this I started the chipping process, first to add the light chips with a sponge. For this vehicle I wanted to keep the chipping light. The vehicle is quite old now, but I wanted to depict a vehicle that is well maintained. So there are lots of smaller chips and not many large patches. When doing the light chips, I used the same light green colour for both of the green colours, and for the black areas I used a grey colour. When the sponge chipping is done, I go over it with a very fine brush to add chips in places that were missed by the sponge, and to add extra chips where I think they are needed. I always focus the chipping in areas that will be more likely to have them in real life, thinking about where the crew will be more likely to touch, such as the handles and hatches. When the light chipping is completed, I again use a very fine brush to add chips where the paint has been completely removed. For the fuel tanks I use Vallejo steel, which has a metallic effect, and for the other parts of the tank I use my regular combination of Vallejo black grey and hull red to create a dark reddish black colour. On the rubber side skirts I use a grey black colour. Next I start painting the various smaller parts of the tank. The gun barrels are painted black grey, and this colour was also used on the caps of the smoke launchers. For the lights and vision ports I start by painting over them with a dark grey colour. Once it is dried I've painted over several layers of wet effects to make it very glossy and look like glass. For this part I used a similar process. Actually I'm not very sure what this part is, but I assume a light or something. In all my references these were perfectly white, so I first painted them white and then added wet effects. Another part that I'm also not sure what it is this container thing on the fenders. From my references I saw this was a sort of faded grey colour, so to recreate this I started by painting it a light grey. Next I add small dots of a white and darker grey with a fine brush. Then I use wet blending with the same base grey colour and a slight darker grey to blend in the previous dots of paint and to add more variation. Finally I wet blended a light sand colour over it to again add more variation. I forgot to take a video of the end result, so here's a picture from the completed build so that you can see how it looks. For the fuel lines I started by painting them in a dark grey colour. Afterwards I used wet blending with a light rusty brown colour and white to add some colour variation and to make the fuel lines look old. For the toe cables, these were first painted dark grey with Vallejo acrylics. Once they had dried, I blended over rust coloured oil paints to make the toe cables look old. First, I dampened them with odourless thinner. This is so that the paint will blend easier and won't start drying once it's put on. Next, I start dotting on the rust colours, trying to make sure that the colour is different on each part without large sections of the same colour. If the effect is too strong, you can reapply the odourless thinner and remove more of the paint. Oil paints will give you a longer time that you can change the paint, so let it dry to the touch, then work out whether to add or remove some of the paint. Next was a pin wash. For pin washes I always use enamel paints as I had some bad experiences with oils, where the paint colour ended up changing after it had dried. For the enamel pin wash I use a dark brown colour as I think the black colour is too strong. This is lightly dotted around all of the details and recessed lines, allowing capillary action to move the paint around. After letting it dry a little, I use a brush and cotton bud dipped in odourless thinner to remove the excess paint. Now, going back to the tracks. Earlier, these had been painted a very dark brown colour. Next, I sprayed a slightly less dark brown colour made from Tamiya XF86 NATO Brown and XF69 NATO Black. This is sprayed all over, but for this process I tried to spray more paint in some areas than others to add more variation. It won't matter too much, as the effects later will completely go over them. The rubber parts of the wheels were carefully painted with a black-grey colour. Next I started adding the mud texture. This is made from silica sand, brown pigment powder, plaster, water and thinner. This was put onto the lower hull, wheels and tracks and then blended with water. This time I made the mud effect quite heavy. I also wanted the mud to look wet, so I randomly applied dark mud enamel paint over the mud texture and blended the paint with odourless thinner. Speckling was also used all over the areas with the mud texture and also in the inside of the tracks to make them a bit dirtier. I also added some mud streaks to the sides of the tank, again with enamels. First I put on the enamel paint at the bottom of the area that I'm painting, then I add odourless thinner in the area where I will add the streaks. After this I use a brush to drag up and down to create the streaks. I used the same paint on the upper hull to make it look a little dirty, but I didn't add too much as I didn't want this part to look too muddy. This was done in a similar way as before. First I add the paint, then the odourless thinner in the area where I will blend the paint, then I blend it. This time I dab the brush on. Now I add the final layer of mud. This time I use a fresh mud effect, which is another enamel paint. This is only used in a few places and then blended with odourless thinner. Also you can see the mud enamels were speckled over the side skirts. I used some black paint and a 0.2mm airbrush to add the exhaust smoke. This vehicle is operated by the Finnish, and Finland has quite a bit of snow, so I thought this would be a good time to try out some snow effects on this vehicle. I looked at a few different products and techniques to do this and decided to go with Tamiya Snow Effect Texture Paint. Tamiya has two versions of this product, one with a coarse grain and another with a very fine grain. I want to make slightly soft melted snow rather than fresh snow, so I went with a fine grain version. I also bought snow micro balloons from AK Interactive. This will be used later to create a fresher and fluffier snow effect. Because this is my first time working with these products, I started by adding the snow behind the running gear, so that it won't matter too much if I make any mistakes. I wanted the tank to look as if it had just driven through some soft clean snow, so I added a lot of it around the bottom half of the lower hull. The Tamiya snow paste is quite easy to work with. It's acrylic base, so once it's in the position I want it, I just use water to soften the edges and blend it on. The same process is used on the wheels. First I put the snow on with a brush straight from the bottle, then I blend it with water. I put the majority of the snow around the edges of the wheels. For the tracks, again the process is the same, putting the snow into place and blending with water. When I was adding snow to the top of the tank, I wanted to make sure that it didn't completely cover it, so I decided to try to make it look as though the snow had melted and left some smaller patches of snow. The snow was applied in the same way as before, but I only added a small amount first. If I decide it's not enough, then I can always add more later, but trying to remove it after it's dried will be hard. When I was adding the snow, I tried to place it in areas that would be more likely to be in the shade, as these would be the places that haven't been melted as much yet. I also chose to add very little snow around the engine deck. After the snow has completely dried on the wheels, I went over it with wet effects to make it look as though it had melted. Now that the lower hull parts are completed, I fitted them into place. For the snow on the upper surfaces, I also went over them with the wet effects to make it look slightly melted. The wet effects will also make the snow look more transparent, which helps to give the melted icy look. The wet effects are blended with odorless thinner. Because I don't want all of the snow to look melted, I added a few areas with more fresher snow. First I added white glue in the areas where I wanted to add the fresh snow, then whilst the glue is wet I sprinkle over the AK snow microballoons. Once it's dry I blow away the excess. Antennas were added with stretched sprue and painted black. I also bought some 23mm ammunition. I know that these aren't exactly right as the ItPsv90 uses 35mm rounds, but I couldn't find anything else and I don't think you can really tell the difference in the end. I painted a few of the spent shell casings green and glued them into place with white glue. I added some water streaks around a few of the areas with the snow. This was done with a very fine brush and a small amount of wet effects. I very gently brush it on, trying to keep the line thin and a little uneven. And with that, the build is completed. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel.